all for being here tonight. And I want to thank the Historical Society for hosting this event and to Travis Nygard for creating this event. I was so happy when he invited me to come and talk about my dad. But it posed a bit of a dilemma. Do I present my dad's entire life? Do I just focus on his Ripon College days? What I decided to do was to present his life up to the age of 32. Why age 32? Because he was 32 in 1944, and that is when he moved to Ripon, became artist in residence at Ripon College, and founded the art department. And it's also the year that he created 2 large paintings for the student union at Ripon College that Travis is going to tell you about after the slideshow. So thank you all for being here. So I really want you to get to know my dad. And in order to do that, I first need to introduce you to his parents. Whoop.
Sorry, I'm just going to go through and mute anyone that's not muted.
Forever.
Okay, my dad's parents, this is Martha and Abraham. They were Jewish. They grew up in a small town in Russia. Abraham was born in 1875, and by the time Martha was born in 1881, there were pogroms in Russia, anti-Jewish riots. Long story, but the pogroms took off because of general resentment towards the Jews. Life was hard and dangerous for Martha and Abraham. And they came to the United States in the late 1890s. I mean, their story could be a presentation in and of itself. But anyway, they came to the United States within a couple of years of each other. They weren't married yet. But they settled in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. And they were married June 10th, 1900, and it was the first Jewish wedding in Manitowoc. Wow. Now, my dad's father, Abraham, he started out as a scrap dealer, peddling iron and metal objects, and for the first time in his young life, he had the freedom and the right to pursue a direction of achievement and self-employment of his choice. At the time, he couldn't speak English, but he was fluent in Polish, Russian, and German. And that enabled him to buy rags and scrap metals from those nationalities that settled in and around the Manitowoc area. Now, really, to get to know my dad, you need to know where he grew up. And he was born in 1912 in Manitowoc, and I'm sure most of you know where Manitowoc is, but it's situated in eastern Wisconsin, right on Lake Michigan. And it's known for it's a major shipbuilder for the Great Lakes. This is where World War II submarines were built. And now we're going to go back to 1909. And my dad's father, Abraham, a scrap dealer, founded one of Manitowoc's best-known industries, the Wisconsin Aluminum Foundry. The foundry started out making castings for early automobiles, home pressure cookers, griddles, and it continues as a private company owned by the Schwartzes to this day. Now I want to introduce you to my dad's siblings. He has 6 brothers and a sister. The oldest was Anne, seated on the far right. His oldest brother was Meyer, and in the back, my dad's in the middle, surrounded by his brothers, youngest to oldest. Now, all his brothers worked for the foundry except for these 3. Rudy was an attorney. He did legal work for the Wisconsin Aluminum Foundry, but had his own private law practice. And Izzy, he was in medical school for a short time, and then he decided he wanted to be a business owner. So for 50 years, he owned Kutnick and Schwartz shoe store in downtown Manitowoc. And then my dad, he had absolutely no interest in working for the foundry because he knew from an early age he wanted to be an artist. A life of art, an artful life was what he had envisioned. And so this photo, he's probably about 5 years old. And the photo on the right, he's 13, 14 years old. So now at age 12, he's experimenting with watercolors. Also at age 12, he's experimenting with pen and ink drawings, cartooning. By age 14, he is working with pastels, and this is a portrait that he did of his mother, Martha. And then this is his first oil painting. He finally acquired oil paints at age 14, and this is called Society Equestrian. And it's an interesting painting. I actually brought it. It's on one of the easels. So after the program, you can take a closer look at it. But what's interesting about this piece is that he's able to make the black riding crop show up against her black riding attire. A few brushes of white gives the illusion of the belt. And it's a simple painting, but with a big impact. Now, by high school, my dad is the art editor for the Manitou. My dad's going to Lincoln High School. The Manitou is a publication that it's published by the students of Lincoln High School, and my dad contributed cartoons to the publication. So here's just a few samples. Now, so my dad graduates Lincoln High School in 1930, and he receives a full scholarship to go to the School of the Art Institute. The scholarship is in commercial art, logos, advertising, but my dad's passion is painting, sculpture, printmaking, but nobody's going to turn down a scholarship during the Great Depression. So now, the Art Institute is a 4-year school. I'm going to begin by talking about his first 2 years at the Art Institute. He's spending time on Oak Street Beach doing pen and ink drawing. He is taking his first printmaking class in lithography. This is another litho he did. This piece is titled Feathered Hat. I'm going to talk about it a little later in the slideshow. He's also spending time in the museum gallery, studying and copying the masters. These would be Leonardo da Vinci examples. And while a student, my dad qualified as a member for the Works Progress Administration, the WPA Federal Art Program. It was one of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's most important Depression-era agencies. Now, my dad was assigned to easel and mural paintings by the committee and staff directing the Chicago program. And my dad said the impact of this supportive fine art program of perhaps the most stressful and psychologically devastating period of the 20th century was enormous, as it provided a decent survival subsidy for the mature artist to continue his creative career. Now, this is just a sample drawing of a large mural that he created for the Skokie School. And on the bottom, it says mural design Skokie School, Winnetka, Illinois, WPA 1932. What's interesting is that I found out my mother-in-law, Barbara Roeper, went to Skokie School in the 1940s, and she remembered the mural and that it hung in the cafeteria at the school. I don't know what happened to it though, but. Okay, now again, we're in my dad's first 2 years at the Art Institute. So he's taking printmaking classes, he's taking design classes, experimenting with shapes, color, texture to create collages. And of course, he's taking figure drawing classes with live models. But by the end of the second year at the Art Institute, this would be spring of '33, my dad became disillusioned with the teaching, and he was also concerned about the expenses his father was incurring. Because during this time, one of my dad's older brothers was in medical school, one of his younger brothers is in law school, and even though my dad was on a full scholarship, there were still living expenses. So he moves back to Manitowoc. And my dad said this was a time of deep depression, financially as well as spiritually, for nearly everyone. My father, Abraham, was extraordinarily cooperative and offered encouraging forbearance with strong spiritual support. At a time, anyone pursuing art as a career was considered eccentric, as you were assured that picture painting could lead only to the most humiliating and wretched poverty. So now, back to the Wisconsin Aluminum Foundry. By this time, a few of my dad's brothers are working for the foundry. My dad still has no desire to work for the aluminum foundry. He just still wants to focus on his art. Fortunately, his father, Abraham, continued to encourage him to pursue his art. And his father, Abraham, actually gave him an empty part of the building to turn into an art studio. This is a portrait he did of his parents, Father Abraham, Mother Martha. They're not dated, but I'm guessing 30s or 40s, and it's possible that he painted these when he moved home from the Art Institute. We know both of his parents were really supportive of his pursuit as an artist, but and I can only speculate that Martha welcomed him home during this time. I mean, Martha had 8 children. A couple were in college. The others, had moved out by this time and were starting their own lives. So the only child at home at this time was my dad's 9-year-old brother, Milt. So my dad lived in Manitowoc. He used the studio at the foundry for 2 years, and he described it as a kind of seclusion and retreat from the formal art institution. He said, I found myself working in an industrial ambiance, and this was satisfying. After about 1.5 years, though, he became restless and missed the monumental cultural life Chicago offered. And in his autobiography, he said, I missed life in the big city, the theater, concerts, ballet, and my art student friends, and the endless bull sessions on art. So he moves back to Chicago, re-enrolls in the Art Institute. My dad said, I would return to the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, enter the 3rd year of the program, follow and accept the teachings of my painting professor, and become a super academic figure painter and excellent draftsman. Another spark of light made me recall that if a student would complete his 4th year to graduation, he could qualify to compete for the Traveling Fellowship Awards. So my dad had a choice of 2 professors. He chose Boris Anisvald. He was a Russian-American painter and theater designer. Also in his 3rd year at the Art Institute, he falls in love with Marjorie Dottie Arnett. She was a model at the Art Institute. We can take a moment to read the slide before I change it. So, falls in love with Marjorie, and she introduces my dad to a whole new world. My dad's words, I had never been outdoorish or campish. I'd also like to add that my dad liked being near water, but not in the water. He really was, a suit and tie, shiny shoe kind of guy. Anyway, Marjorie, she was beautiful, had a love for the outdoors, being in nature, and she introduced my dad to the outdoors, even lured him into the water. She took him to one of her favorite places, the Indiana Dunes. Now, Marjorie was also the source of inspiration behind the female figure in my dad's painting. And although their relationship ended in the 40s, her likeness continued to appear in his paintings throughout his career. Her big eyes, her tall, slender body, full lips. Now, still in his 3rd year at the Art Institute, he creates this beautiful large oil painting called Young Chorus Girl. And it wins first prize at the 40th annual exhibit by Artists of Chicago and Vicinity. Now my dad is in his senior year, his 4th year at the Art Institute. This is 1936-37. There's now a request from the Boyer Art Gallery in New York to exhibit his work. The American Federation of Arts in D.C. wants to include my dad in Volume 2 of Who's Who in American Art. And this lithograph that I showed you earlier, Feathered Hat, is accepted in the 6th Annual International Exhibit of Lithography and Wood Engravings in Chicago. So now more and more people are expressing interest in buying my dad's work. His name is starting to appear in multiple Chicago newspapers. for his art. Now, senior year is the end of senior year now, and he has the opportunity to enter the traveling fellowship competition. There's 4 categories that the artist must submit: a figure painting, a figure drawing, and create a proposed mural design for the west wall of the Art Institute's Goodman Theater lobby. And then the 4th submission would be a full-size drawing of any section of the design, not less than 25 square feet. I'm not sure what section of the design he actually chose, but he entered art into the 4 categories, and he wins the Ryerson Traveling Fellowship. And so he won $2,500 and a trip around the world by steamship. And we looked this up. $2,500 in 1937 would be the equivalent of almost $50,000 today. This is a big deal. So he graduates from the Art Institute in June of 37. And then he begins the fellowship journey by flying to New York to get on the Dollar steamship line. So he boards the Dollar steamship, and he begins the journey by traveling to Havana, Cuba. He goes through the Panama Canal, up to the port of LA, and then off to Hawaii, and then Kobe, Japan. I included a pen and ink drawing that we did while in Kobe, Japan. And so from Japan, he travels to Shanghai, China, to Hong Kong, and then makes his way to the Philippines. And while he's in the Philippines, he immerses himself into his art. I mean, my sisters and I, we probably have 100 of these drawings, and he may have done a couple hundred on the Philippines. So this is just a few samples of just some of the simple pen and ink drawings he was doing while in the Philippines. Okay, the Girl Scout. I had a Girl Scout in the Philippines in 1937. I had to look that one up. And I found out the first Girl Scout troops were organized in the Philippines as early as 1918, and they were directly registered with the Girl Scouts of the United States. I did not know that. Okay. He's in Manila, Philippines, and takes the Dollar steamship line to Singapore. Now he has to make a decision, because the Dollar steamship line is going to head to India. My dad has his heart set on going to the island of Bali in this area. So what does he do? He buys a second-class ticket, steamship ticket, for $45 on the Heaping Mo steamship line that takes them from Singapore to Batavia, which is now Jakarta. I don't know if he went by land or sea, but he did finally end up in Bali and spent many, many months there immersed in his artwork. I have just a few samples from that, from Bali. Okay, so he finally goes back to Singapore to get back on the Dollar steamship line, and he does go to India. Okay, now he's traveled through Japan and China and East Asia, India and South Asia, the Philippines, Java and Bali and Indonesia, and experiencing sights he's never seen before. He is interacting with the local people and seeking to understand how others live. And all the while, he's drawing and painting. I'm going to mention it a little bit later in the slideshow, but he created over 1,000 drawings and almost 200 paintings on this trip. So from India, the Dollar steamship line takes him to the Arabian Sea, Red Sea, through the Suez Canal to the Mediterranean, because he's on his way to Europe now. And the steamship docks in Naples. The blue line indicates he took a train to Rome, and while he was in Rome, he studied at the American Academy for a short period of time. And then he goes back to Naples, gets back on the Dallas steamship line that takes him to Genoa, Italy. And then it docks in Marseille, France. And he takes the train, travels through France, Switzerland, and into Germany. Now, my dad was in Germany in November of 1938 during Kristallnacht, the night of broken glass, the occasion of concerted violence by Nazis throughout Germany and Austria against Jewish people and their property. Synagogues were torched, Jewish homes, schools, and businesses vandalized, hundreds of Jews were killed, thousands arrested. So as a Jew, my dad was frightened. He left Germany as quickly as he could. And while on the train, and I remember he told me the story, he was given the Nazi salute, but he didn't salute back and he was moved to a different train car. Failure to salute, even for a foreign tourist in 1938, was risky. Why the pen drawing of Soviet leader Joseph Stalin? I'm not sure, other than that Stalin and Hitler were allies leading up to the war and in the early part of the war, and it's quite possible that there is a pen and ink drawing of Adolf Hitler out there somewhere.
Yeah.
So anyway, he quickly leaves Germany and he goes to Paris. And Paris in the 30s, it was the home and meeting place of some of the world's most prominent painters, sculptors, composers, dancers, poets, writers. Picasso, Gertrude Stein, and so many, and many more were there at this time. And so he immerses himself into his artwork when he's in Paris. And again, these are just a few samples of what he was doing. He was also studying at the Colorado Academy while he was in Paris. And while at the Café Dome, he did cross paths with Pablo Picasso. And Pablo Picasso really was one of his earliest influences. This is a portrait that he did of Picasso many decades after this, in 1986. And perhaps he was just reflecting back on his time, on the fellowship. But speaking of Picasso, while my dad was on the traveling fellowship, he received a letter from the Dean of the Art Institute in June of '38. The letter mentions that my dad's artwork is on display in the Georgine Schiller Gallery, where he's represented along with Pablo Picasso. And Georgine Schiller Smith, she was an artist and an art patron, and she had a large art collection that contained important examples of contemporary art that included Van Gogh, Monet, and Picasso. She purchased my dad's Young Forest Girl after it won first prize in that exhibit. She took it home to Philadelphia with her, and her intent was to give this painting to the city of Philadelphia as a memorial gift. I can't find any additional information on it, so I don't know if it was donated or if she kept it in her collection, but I thought that was pretty cool. Van Gogh, Monet, Picasso, and a Schwartz. So, my dad returns from the Ryerson Traveling Fellowship. He's exhibiting his work in New York. He has the first one-man show in the contemporary galleries of the Chicago Art Institute, which was the first ever by a returning fellowship student. And the exhibit showcases his oils, watercolors, and drawings that he created around the world. And like I mentioned before, over 1,000 drawings and almost 200 paintings. So now, in addition to living and exhibiting his work in Chicago and New York, for a short period he lived in Woodstock, New York, which would have been a thriving art colony in the 1940s. Now, from 1942 to 1944, my dad served in the U.S. Army at Fort Belvoir, Virginia, and Fort Leonard Wood in Missouri as a member of the camouflage section of the Engineer Corps. So, while serving in the armed forces, Private Schwartz was commissioned during off-duty hours to create murals for the chapels on the Army base. he created 4 large murals. This photo isn't very good because it was taken from a newspaper clipping, but he did one depiction of the resurrection. I don't know why there's an American soldier kneeling next to the tomb. He did 2 depictions of the resurrection. This is just a stunning piece. I've never seen the original, but we have a beautiful black and white photo that I made the slide from. But anyway, he did two depictions of the Last Supper. And these were huge. I mean, this was 7 feet wide, 4 feet high, and I believe this one actually hung above an altar in one of the chapels on the Army base. This is the second depiction of the Last Supper. Again, not a great photo because it's from a newspaper clipping. And then the 4th one he did was the Ascension. Now, after 2 years in the Army, he moves back to Wisconsin. He's 32 years old now, and it's time for a career. Before he begins his career, he worked at the Leighton Art School in Milwaukee and taught summer painting and drawing classes. And then my dad accepted the position as artist in residence at Ripon College. So he moved to Ripon and founded the art department in 1944. And he came to Ripon for what he thought would be a year, but he said, I was going to leave for the big city, but I liked Green Lake and Ripon and the college. So he was given, where's the size?
Put this.
All right, come back. No? Okay. Oh, there it is. Okay. All right. He was provided the Tracy House to use as his art studio. I don't know if Tracy House was a fraternity or a sorority house, but one or the other. So he was given that to use as a studio. And Clark Keebler was president at the time and was really supportive of my dad and a big fan of his work. And this brings me to my last slide. This is the Ripon College yearbook, the Crimson 1945. And it's a Lester Schwartz. Ripon's first resident artist has been very popular during his first year at Ripon. Besides teaching art and putting on exhibits, he painted murals for the student union. So that brings us to Travis Nygard's segment of tonight's program. He's going to tell you about the 2 large paintings that my dad created. So thank you so much.
Well, that was fascinating. Thank you so much. So what I would like to do is actually show you 2 different paintings that are still in the collection of Ripon College. They hang on the 2nd floor of Todd Weir Hall in 2 of the most heavily used classrooms at the college. One of them you see here, it's called Ripon College and the Beginning. The other one you see here is titled Captain Mapes and the Founding of Brockway College. So in the upper left corner there is a steamboat, and that would be the steamboat of Captain Mapes. Mapes founded the city of Ripon after having a boat that sunk that ruined his prior business. So Ripon was his second major project, I guess. Well, maybe more than that. Excellent. What else have you noticed? Yes.
Well, no, just on that point, in tonight's paper, or yesterday's, the most current Commonwealth, it says that Mr. Horner arrived to Ripon by boat on the water.
Yeah.
Right.
And it says on the site of the Gothic Mill Pond. So could you put a boat in Silver Creek?
No, that's gotta be a mistake.
There's some confusion about that.
Yeah, that's gotta be a mistake. That's
Oh, it was in
Could have been like a canoe or something much smaller, like, at a higher water table.
Horner had a farm out in the south shore of Green Lake, so I think he probably rode a horse.
But this was probably the when he was fighting the Black Hawk War.
Yeah. So perhaps Horner arrived via boat, maybe not.
You got him
Right.
Yeah.
What else did the rest of you notice? Anyone?
The boys have a squirrel.
A squirrel. All
Yeah,
right.
the 2 boys they're like sitting in the
Whoops.
lower left, like.
Yes, there's a squirrel in the lower left here by the two young guys with Ripon College Mars sweaters on. And squirrels are still beloved today by the students, by the way. We have plenty of them. Great. Other things you're noticing?
Which one are we looking at?
Being more shy, I'm happy to point out a few of the things that I think are interesting. So in the one that we started out here, of course, we have in the upper left the steamboat of Captain Mapes. There is also on the upper right the railroad coming to Ripon. Ripon actually was initially two different communities that have since merged. One was called Ceresco, that's the earliest community, named after Ceres, the goddess of agriculture. She's on the left here. They founded a utopian community in the Longhouse, which a version of which is still standing after being reconstructed in the 30s. A picture of the Longhouse is there. Eventually, Ripon College was founded, and here are the proud founders as they, I believe, banged this first stake into the ground. At least that's how I'm interpreting that. At that time, it was called Brockway College, which is why it's called Brockway College here. And then there's the studious students and the handsome professor. And then early buildings from the community are all across the bottom of the screen. One of them that you probably recognize is the little white schoolhouse. I believe this is Bartlett Hall, which at one time had a tower on the top. Now it's a little bit flat-roofed. I'm sure we could identify other buildings if we kept working at it. That might be Ingram Hall in the middle, which was a multi-purpose academic building. Then in the other one here, we have the Civil War, which was enormously disruptive all over the country. Early street scenes of Ripon, early graduates, more students being studious and I believe getting their diplomas, studying sciences on the right, and more early buildings from the community all across the bottom. I believe this one on the right is still standing and used at the college. I believe that's East Hall, and then that, I believe, is the First Congregational Church, which is right next to it as well. Another special treat is that the family actually found what I think is incredibly cool. There is a sketch for these murals that's in the family collection, and it's here if you want to take a look at it. Art historians love sketches of things. It's like a sneak peek into the mind of the artist, right? And you can see that the steamboat is there, the longhouse is there, the early buildings are there, and so forth. And some of the rest is still being worked out, but that's a lot of fun to take a look at as well. All right. Shall we transition into the video and then a discussion? I think so.
Well, I was going to be the Paul Gauguin, you know, the friend of Vincent van Gogh. I won this traveling fellowship, the Edward L. Ryerson, that took me around the world for 2.5 years. So I designed the steamship itinerary to go to Bali. It was from San Francisco to Kobe, Japan, and then down to the Philippines, down to Manila, to Java, which is now Jakarta. And the plan was to study in Paris, to spend a year, and that's where I met Picasso. I'm so interested in color, and and you know, when you're doing the image or you're doing figurative paintings, you're controlled by reality, you know, by what's there. And there's a degree of freedom when you leave this restriction and to follow the natural patterns of color and line, shape, space. She was very important, and I believe many of the girls that I do, I'm I feel as though that each one I do is different, each character, but it isn't. There's a subconscious response, to an ideal. And I believe it relates to her. Actually, this started very early, when I would go through my father's scrapyard when I was 8 years old, and I'd pick up pieces of metal. I'd go to the scrapyard as often as I could. Sometimes I'd skip school for this, and nail them onto the garage or wherever. And it was quite an exciting thing. But it's kind of interesting. I'm doing the same thing now with bigger pieces in different yards at 83. This was the tribute to my father, Abraham, and it was the Hebrew was Avram, and I believe the first title of it was a tribute to Avram. And these patterns they're mahogany, and they're made to specifications for machine parts. And some of these pieces, my father had the contract for all the aluminum parts of the Harley-Davidson motorcycle in the 1920s, 1930s. They're made by pattern makers who would spend weeks on them from blueprint specifications. I remember watching them. This was before I was married, and we were just developing the land and the character of it. There was a trash pile where the house is, and I stood on top of the trash pile, and this was before I was married, and I said, there'll be a house here one day. And so here it is, and you really realize what you visualize, I created a shelf out of a hill after the buildings were gone, covered it with white sand rather than blacktop. I was very much influenced by Frank Lloyd Wright. This is a composition. All the trees are planted so one or more would relate to each other. One group of trees would relate to each other. And some were deciduous trees, some conifers, and I was very conscious of texture. This is very similar to putting colors and patterns and values and textures on paintings, Mm-hmm. Only it's much more complex and much more expensive than a painting. I was very conscious of doing something that would be entertaining. And my first concept was to have the circus and the cabaret and the carnival, which is actually our Mardi Gras. And my wife, who was my student at Ripon College at that time, enrolled in art, and she hated art. She didn't want to be in class, and she was sort of a cowboy. She wanted to be outdoors, loved the farm. The farm became Gloria Hills after her death. Tanya and Randy were married here on the grounds, and I thought I'd do a piece of sculpture for them. Well, this piece goes up 35, 40 feet and weighs about 3,000 pounds. And that was finished just before the ceremony. And so after the ceremony, I asked Tanya to take it along. It's only I would tie a ribbon on it, and she said she'd come back to it. So while I was a professor at Ripon College, I bought the tallest building in Oshkosh. I have this fixation about something big, and I think it's still here in my sculpture. When you acquire something, a new building, you're inspected in every way. And so the inspector came to the restaurant, and he wanted to see the silverware, and I had about 1,000 pieces of tableware. And he saw these little specks on the spoons and knives. I couldn't see them. He said, well, you can't use this tableware. But I wasn't going to throw it out. And I looked at it, and I thought I could recycle this to sculpture. Because of the shapes, and it's pliable, you can bend it, turn it, you can weld it. So I also thought of the inspector. I was doing both, creating art and bending the inspector. So that was therapeutic. I think my favorite piece is the Miller Tower. I had the thought of doing something in bottles, but the construction was a problem. And it was resolved in Lima, Peru, when I was in the cocktail lounge.
and saw this coat rack with the inverted bottles. And those are just, the bottles, 1,000 bottles are gravity supported on steel rods. This is called the Miller Tower, and the title is engraved in stone, and that is, there ain't no beer in heaven, drink Miller's here. For the past 10 years I've been leaving the country in autumn for about 3 or 4 months and experienced different countries, and there's an influence of the environment and the people. Being away, for 3 months or 4 months of painting, to come back and to return and to work three-dimensionally, they complement each other, and this is a great feeling of creativity. Well, I recommend this to everyone who's getting older, to work and have a challenge each day of something to do and something to develop and something to create, whether it be paint or doing your living room. I remember my mother was very sensitive to composition, and you think that art is totally separated from real life, something else, it's something ivory tower and all that stuff, and philosophical and all, and psychological. It doesn't have to be that. It isn't that, really. But, my mother would have us move the piano around, and it was never in the right place, and the piano is a pretty big item to be moving. So she'd get the proper balance of the room, and then she'd hang my paintings to relate to that. I just hope I can extend the circus concept. It'd probably become more fanciful. And now I just feel strongly about sharing this and having this extended so that it'll be entertaining to the public for many years ahead. And I'd also like to have the house, the whole grounds, the 260 acres available for the public and develop. And that would take about another 75 years. And all I can do is look back. And so I stayed after school, and she said, you'll do 3 pages of tulips, exactly as I drew them on the board, and I've disliked tulips ever since. She jumped out of bed, put on her leather jacket and her shoes over her her leather jacket over her nightgown, and jumped in the Jeep with her rifle. She always had a rifle, a .22 under the bed. All her life is kind of a circus,
Thanks, Tanya, and thank you all for coming.